Welcome back to the next session of the North Carolina Virtual Family History Fair. For this session, we're going to be talking about the genealogy of a house or researching the history of your house. Our presenters are three members of the North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office. I'm Michael Southern. I'm a architectural historian and GIS, or computer mapping and database coordinator. With me is Claudia Brown, who's supervisor of the National Register and Survey and National Register branch, and Mitch Wiles, who is supervisor of the Restoration Services branch. We're going to be covering three basic areas in researching the history of your house. I'm going to be discussing how you can determine what kind of information, if anything at all, has been previously collected about your house. And and Claudia will talk about conducting original research with real estate records, deeds, city directories, Sanborn maps, and other sources. And Mitch will be talking about what the building itself tells you about its period of construction, later alterations, and so forth through architectural analysis. The first thing you might do is just determine what anything at all has ever been any information has been previously collected about your house. Has it been surveyed and an architectural field surveyed and photographed or researched in any way in the past? Is there a file for the house or its neighborhood at the State Historic Preservation Office? Might it be listed in the National Register of Historic Places or in a National Register of Historic District? Or could it be in a locally designated landmark or within a local historic district? And has it been covered in any sort of architectural survey publication? The answer to most of these questions are online. The online sources are HBO Web. It's a web map service our office has developed for the statewide historic building survey. National Register of Historic Places nominations, which are online. And paper sources that may have information, the files of the State Historic Preservation Office, and published architectural surveys. I'm going to be first looking at some online resources, and we're going to do these first with screen captures. If there's time after I go through that, we'll do a quick live demonstration of some of these features. Our starting point is the North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office homepage. You can just Google North Carolina Preservation Office and probably find it at the top. And you see the address there, hboncdcr.gov. The places we're going to be looking at are the online. I see my, I'm going to have to use my thing here. The first site we're going to go to is the HBO Web, which is the online historic mapping service, down here among the features on the home page. When you first open it, you'll see the splash screen, and there are some couple of things to note. There's a tutorial tab up here if you want some help as you look for it. There is a somehow I moved forward and I didn't want to. When you're ready to start the search, down here at the bottom you'll see the agree button, which means you agree to the terms of service. It does not require a password or any sort of log-on. The site may appear to be bewildering at first. There are over 100,000 points of surveyed properties, 2,400 individual listings in the National Register of Historic Places, and 570 National Register districts, some of which contain many hundreds of properties, as well as local landmarks, local districts, and other types of historic designations we won't have time to get into. If you've used Google Maps before, you'll find the navigation bar over on the left will probably be familiar. It's very similar. You can scroll with your mouse to zoom in and out. I'm going to zoom into one North Carolina town, Lewisburg, which is a good representative. Most North Carolina towns have some sort of National Register district at the core, an older neighborhood, the old commercial area, and that sort of area. And this map will very quickly show you the boundaries of those areas. There is a legend tab at the top, which will show you what all these colors mean. The only one I'm going to point out now is the blue. A boundary line indicates the boundary of a National Register district or property, and a blue dot indicates a place is listed in the National Register individually. One of the features, you'll notice there are a couple of tabs in the upper right that are very useful. One is HBO data layers, which includes each of the different types of historic designations you can turn on and off to simplify the screen. And there's another one with a number of different backgrounds. What I'm going to do is cut off boundary shading, because that enables us, when we look at aerial backgrounds, to see what we're looking at. There's also there's an address tool at the top that you can click, enter the address of any place in the state, for that matter the United States, and it should zoom you straight to the location within a map. I've entered I think 104 Sunset Avenue, Lewisburg, North Carolina, which happens to be Mitch's house, and then I'm going to zoom into it. I can see its location a little better. I'm not sure exactly which of those surveyed points, which you see at this point, labels open up that show the name of the property. But I click on the Winston Allen house and to see that it is indeed at 104 Sunset Avenue. You can one of the options in the background options in the upper right is most recent aerial view, and there are other older aerial views you can see, as well as different kinds of map backgrounds you can look. This is a high resolution aerial map, and we can see the property from the air, and you can zoom in pretty close. It also has a street view tool up on the top bar there that's highlighted, and there you can, if you select, you've got a couple of choices for how to view the results. We're going to look in a new browser window and click on the street in front of the house you want to look at, and this screen pops up with a map, a street view shot, and another aerial. You can cut off the aerial of the map to see a good image of the house. This is very good images in many places. Street view is not universal, it's not everywhere, but it's in most towns, major streets in most towns. And with the using the navigation tools in Google in Street View, you can actually walk up and down the streets in a historic district and look at see all manner of things. By clicking within the boundary of a National Register Historic District, or actually on any of these points, an information window will pop up. For places listed in the National Register, you'll see there's a link to the National Register nomination online, which you can click on. It will open a PDF of the nomination. This is a Lewisburg Historic District in which Mitch's house is located. It's 161 pages. It would take you a long time to kind of scroll through looking to see what it says about the house. But you can search on keywords, and I've entered the address up there in the text search, and it takes me to page 58, where there is a description of the house. Not every National Register district is going to have this much description and also historical background information as this does. What the National Register district nomination may be most helpful for is kind of getting a general background of the development of the town or the neighborhood, and kind of giving a historical and architectural context for your house within that neighborhood. Other features, if you happen to already know that your property's in the National Register, you can click on the National Register icon on the home page. You'll see one of the options to go to a list of National Register listings. You can search by county. All 3,000 North Carolina National Register listings are on this page. You can link to the PDF of the nomination, and you can link to the map location that in our HBO web, which we've just been looking at. There's also a keyword research search tool across all 3,000 nominations, where you can enter a keyword and the results will pop up every nomination where that occurs. Obviously, if you're looking on a common word or name, you're going to find you'll get many hits. I've entered the surname Hooser or Hauser, and I search on that among nominations, and I get 41 results where the name appears within National Register nominations, and you can open each one up and then use keyword search within the nomination to see where it appears in the text. Not everything is listed in the National Register, of course. Another source are published architectural surveys. Over 50 counties in North Carolina over the past 40 years have had historic architectural surveys published, and about 50 or more municipalities have published surveys separately. These are not online, and many are long out of print and would be hard to find. You can find them through old booksellers sometimes, and our list indicates whether or not they may be available and what the source is. And we look in Franklin County and we see there is indeed a book about the historic district of Lewisburg that includes Mitch's house and an older photograph taken back in the 80s when the book was published. But there are many places that are not in the National Register that are covered in these county survey publications. Wake County, for example, is one of over 50 counties where many modest farmhouses and other buildings are included, where you might find a little bit of published information about your property. But regardless of whether it's in the National Register or in a book, if there's a point for your house or your neighborhood in HBO Web, there will be a backup file for it at the State Historic Preservation Office in Raleigh or in the Western Field Office in Asheville. We maintain there are over 100,000 site files with photographs going back almost 50 years now of some places, and there are many other resources. Some files may actually have documentary photographs, even predating the actual survey. Files include old field notes, correspondence with property owners, research notes, and proofs of old photographs taken in years past. If you live in the western part of the state, the blue area here, you will contact Annie McDonald in the Western office for an opportunity to see the file. And for the rest of the state, contact Chandria Birch. These you do need to make an appointment in either case to be able to come in and take a look at the files. That is, I think I've got about 5 minutes. I'm going to convert to a live demonstration here if I can. This is our website. Is slightly out of kilter, but the central group is supposed to be centered here, but we won't worry about that. I'm going to click on the link to HBO Web and hope it opens. And it does. That's the splash screen I told you about. The tutorial tab up that way. I'm going to agree to the terms of viewing the site. There are all those points. This doesn't have a spinner on it, but I'm going to use the address tool here to look up a property. In this case, if my all thumbs can will work on this, is my own property, 1819. I can't read. I'm not familiar with I'm going to have to use this tab here if I can. Okay. Well, Yep, I'm just going to start over again, and I'll still have time to do it, I think. There's the, well, I'm having some technical difficulty with this. Clear?
No.
I don't see clear. Yeah, I wanted the address. You can enter coordinates and do other things too, but it's, let me try the address one more time. Okay. And what I wanted to do was backspace because it was 1819 white. (1819) White Oak Road, Raleigh, NC, and see if it'll locate it. It does. I'm not sure how to scroll in. I will have to use the button here because I don't have a scrolling mouse. You see it in this case, there is a point there, but it's not a point for my house. It's for a group of houses. We're going to change the background view to the most recent aerial, which, and there it is. And I'm also going to cut off the boundary shading to we can see the aerial better. That's my house, and then I'm going to bring the Street View tool down, and I'm going to open it in a new browser window because that'll give us a better view. And click here in front of my house, and there's the street. I don't know how well I can without the mouse. There you go. There's my house, the two-story one that needs painting. And we can cut off, it's going wild here. But here are the tools you can, with the browsing tool, you can actually wander around any historic district in North Carolina. Okay, this has stopped working. I'm going to shut off the aerial view and the map view, and we get, if I could scroll, which I can't do, we could kind of move in closer. But anyway, that's an example of how you can just drop into any historic district in North Carolina and take a little walking tour, open National Register nominations, and read about the districts and the properties. But I'm going to end there, as my 20 minutes are almost up, and we'll return to Claudia.
All right.
That's the...
Yep. Good afternoon. My career in preservation started a long time ago. And initially I was an independent consultant doing county and municipal architectural surveys and preparing National Register nominations, all of which entailed a good bit of in-depth research. But since joining the State Historic Preservation Office staff in the late 1980s, I've mostly been guiding consultants and the general public in doing their research, their historic preservation projects. So I haven't been doing a whole lot of my own research, but the basics haven't changed much. Of course, the big change is the digital world. And that's a great advantage because now so many of the resources that we need to do our work are online. So, as I said, much of my work is assisting the public, and this is a question I often get. I get a phone call from the territory I cover, and somebody tells me that he or she has just purchased a house, and hey, I hear it's historic, so how do I find out when it was built and who built it? So Michael's already talked to you about the resources that our office offers, our architectural survey files and our publications, National Register nominations, HPO Web, and I'm going to talk about using real estate records, city directories, and touch on title searches a little bit, and also the use of Sanborn and other types of historic maps. So you might think that a title search would be the first option where you should start. But really, these other resources are, I think, a better place to start. They're an easy way to find quite a bit of information about a property. So I'm going to start with real estate records. And in most counties, they're online. So the information in some of the records, some counties' records is rather limited, but in the larger counties, such as Wake County, there's really quite a bit of data. So what I would do is I would go to my browser and I would search on Wake County real estate records. And probably the first thing that would come up in the list of sites is the one that takes you to the county's actual website. And click on that and you'll go to this Wake County real estate data site. So I'm going to search for my house, and you'll see there are a number of options. You can, if you know the owner's name or you know the PIN for the property identification number. I'm going to do a simple, probably the simplest way is just putting in the address. So I've put in 309 Calvin. And then this is the first page that comes up. I stuck in the screenshot from Google Street View of the house. That doesn't come up automatically in this initial page. But if you look at it closely, you'll see that there's a lot of information on this page, and including the date the house was constructed. There's also a date for some major renovations. It tells the number of rooms and this initial page gives the property value and all. So there's also a toolbar near the top of the page, and one of the items on that toolbar is buildings. So I'm going to click on buildings, and this page comes up. And here's where you get more of the data on the about the construction, about the actual building. Here's where you see the year it was built, and then there's also a year for some major modifications to the house. There is a building footprint, and there is the latest photo that was taken by the city, I think probably for the last property reevaluation. It also tells the number of rooms and some other data. Usually this data, real estate records are pretty accurate, at least in Wake County, for properties built after 1900. In some of the more rural counties, actually for rural properties, I've found that you oftentimes can get pretty accurate dates for 19th century properties. And I think that's probably because the property owners or local historians have provided that information to the county. So there's also a tab up there on the toolbar for deeds. And when I click on this, you'll see the list of deeds going back to 1946. And the most recent sale is at the top. That's when my husband and I bought the property in 1988. And then there are a couple of other deeds there. So the previous owner, I knew Edna Smith. We bought the house from her. She moved to a property right down the street, so I was very fortunate I had an opportunity to talk to her, so I got some more information about the house. And before I continue talking about the deeds, I'm just going to show you one other tab. If you click on the map, it takes you to the county's GIS site. It will zoom in on the property. It will show you the building footprints, and then there's also a whole bar of information, sidebar over there to the right, with a lot of the information that was on that real estate records page. So I want to start doing some research, and I'm not going to start with the deeds. I'm going to go from the real estate records. I'm going to use the city directories, and I'm going to try to find out some more information about the people who lived in this house before we bought it. So in my browser, I just Googled Raleigh City Directories, and the first page that came up, first listing I clicked on, and if you look at the lower left, that's the page that came up for the Raleigh City Directories, or for the state's North Carolina City Directories rather. And then I scrolled down and I clicked on Raleigh, and the large screen to the right came up, and it shows all of the city directories that have been digitized. So if you remember, back on that real estate records page, there was the oldest deed that was shown was for 1946, and it was Virginia Smith. In looking at the real estate records, there was no, in the city directories rather, there was no city directory for 1947. Usually the city directories lag for about a year. They gather the information, say in 1946. It doesn't appear until the 1947 city directory. The 47 directory wasn't available, so I looked in 1948. And at the back of the directory there is a street index. And in the image to the left was the page with Calvin Road on it. And zoom in, the section that I circled, you'll see Calvin Road, and it's 309 Calvin Road. And it lists Joseph Smith. Well, it's a Smith. So from here, I went to the alphabetical entries, the property owners' names, and I searched Joseph Smith. And there you see the blow up on the right, Joseph Smith. It turns out his wife was Virginia Smith. So the property was in her name. And it gives you a little bit of information. It indicates that they're owner-occupants. It tells you what his career was. He was a traffic manager. I think that's the Southern, I think it was the Southern Telephone and Telegraph Company, precursor to Southern Bell Telephone and Telegraph Company. So then I wanted to go backwards, search backwards in the city directories. And you can, maybe a good way to do it is if you want to see all the people who lived in the property, go back, say, in 5-year increments. But I went back to the 1920s, because remember, in the real estate records, it said that the house was built in 1927. So I looked at the 1928 directory, and I went to the street index, and I found 309 Calvin. And in the blow-up, you'll see that it was a T.L. Creekmore who was living here. And I went to the alphabetical index by his name, and I found the entry for him. And it tells you, this has quite a bit more information about him. So then I went back and I looked at a few immediately previous directories, and I found that Calvin Road wasn't listed prior to 1925. So I found in 1925, Creekmore was still listed at 309 Calvin, but there weren't any entries for in the street index for Calvin Road prior to 25. I looked him up in the 23 and 1924 alphabetical name entries, and I found that in 24 he was living on Hillsborough Street. Well, of course, deeds are among the best original sources to search. An entire workshop could be devoted just to doing deed research. But for the purposes today, I'm going to show you how you can start here with the real estate records and then do your own deed research or title search from the comfort of your home. So back on that deeds page for my house, the oldest deed was the 1946 deed, and it has the book and page number. So then I went to the Register of Deeds website, and I've listed it here, www.wakegov.com.rod. And this is the first page that comes up in the lower right. I went to the Register of Deeds site. I selected the type of document that I wanted, and in the page to the right, the screen to the right, and I entered deed in the top field. And then I had the book and page number, so that's what I entered down towards the bottom, book and page. And then when I searched on that, the screen that appeared is at the lower left. And from there, you'll see you can click on the PDF of the actual deed, and I did that. And this is part of the screen that came up. So this is the deed. This is when Virginia Smith acquired the property. From there, I went back to the deed page, the search, and I kept going back, and eventually I found that this property had been acquired by a man named A.J. Maxwell. And when I searched on him, this page came up, and you'll see that he acquired a lot of property. There are numerous entries for A.J. Maxwell. So I opened each of them, took a look, and it turns out that the property that the deed or the entry that was the most fruitful, that I've indicated with the red arrow, was the one that he got from the bank and trust company. So when I opened that, I looked at the deed, and I found that this was 1924. He acquired the property, and I found the lot. And of course, I knew the lot, the block and lot number, from the earlier deeds, that initial deed that showed Virginia Smith acquiring it. And there are no improvements cited, so we can be pretty sure that this was simply a lot that the Creekmores were purchasing from the trust, from the bank and trust company. So I can conclude that it was the Creekmores who built the house in 1924 to 1925, as suggested by the city directories. So when looking at primary sources, don't overlook records with the clerk of court either, such as estate or probate records. Early estate records could have property maps that indicate the location of the property. They might have footprints of buildings, and they sometimes have inventories of rooms, and you could match up the number of rooms with the building that you're researching. So maps can be very useful, particularly the Sanborn fire insurance maps. These are maps, the Sanborn Map Company still exists, based in, I think they're still in Poughkeepsie, New York. And they would be hired either by, say, a municipality or maybe insurance companies to produce maps for cities periodically. They're not done every year. But these maps, as you'll see in a minute, show the footprints of the buildings, and they're also coded. There's a code on each property that gives you information about the construction material, the number of stories of the house, and other details about the actual structure. So I'm going to use our previous office at 515 North Blunt Street as an example. This house happens to have been built in 1859. In order to do this particular search, you'd have to know that this house was moved in the late 1970s from its original site on the east side of North Wilmington Street, where it was number 529, and I've circled it. It's circled in that section of the Sanborn map that you see on the right. As I said, these maps weren't issued every year. Someone would have to commission them. But they can be very useful to ID a period of construction. For example, the building might appear in one series, say an 1898 series for Raleigh. It doesn't appear in that, but then it appeared in the 1903 series, so you could assume that it was built, say, around circa 1900. That isn't the case for this particular property. This property we know was built in 1859. But I'm going to show you some changes. If you look at the property as it's shown in 1903, it was a two-story frame dwelling. You can see the porch is in the dotted, front and back porches are indicated by the dotted lines. It was a two-story porch on the front facing Wilmington Street, and on the back there was a one-story porch across the entire rear. But by 1909, part of that rear porch has been enclosed. And then if you skip ahead to 1914, you can see that the rest of the one-story porch on the rear has been enclosed, and also a one-story rear L has been built. And if I jump back, the 1909 map also showed that a two-story bay had been added to the south side of the main block of the house. So skipping ahead to 1914 again, we see that in the main block of the house there are now two side bays of 2 stories, and that there have been a number of additions, changes to the rear of the building. In 1950, it still looks pretty much the same. So, There are also a number of books that might be useful. I've shown you just a few. House Histories was published in 1989. It focuses on both architectural fabric that Mitch is going to talk about and also written and graphic records. Discovering the History of Your House, published in 2002, focuses on research, and the table of contents suggests that this book might be sort of chatty. And then How Do You Research Your House, shown on the right, published in 2007. It has a little bit on the fabric of buildings. Mostly it deals with research. It has a scholarly approach. This book was published in England, so some of the material might be relevant to the United States. So all make the point, and actually stated in a chapter heading of the book that was written by Betsy Green there in the middle, that just because it's written down doesn't mean it's true. So figuring out the history of a building really requires quite a bit of sleuthing and analysis, and it really could be described as putting together numerous puzzle pieces. And one of those pieces has to do with researching, studying the actual fabric of the structure, and that's what Mitch is going to talk about. Give you that.
Thank you. I'm Mitch Wilds, and I am, as Michael said, I'm the head of the Restoration Services branch with the State Historic Preservation Office. And like Claudia said, I'll be looking at the fabric of your house itself. So there really are no digital resources. You would have to get down and get dirty underneath your house or in your attic. But your house is really a member of your family. I think that so many things occur within the house that it really does qualify as a member of your family. So you need to listen to it and get to know it. Here are three houses, all here in North Carolina, all distinctly different. And they kind of introduce what I'm going to be giving an overview of, and that's kind of the changing in technology and how that helps to date a house. I think probably most folks would think that this house would be the earliest of those three, and that would be correct. And virtually all of the fabric in this house is handcrafted. The boards are hand hewn, siding boards are hand dressed, all the trim is hand molded. Then we move up about 80 years to say 1870s. We have this second Empire house, and decidedly different simply because of its design, but also because of its materials. And at this point we're getting a lot of machine-made materials, especially with trim. More national designs are coming into play. But still, you've still got a lot of handcrafted material within the house, even the latter part of the 19th century. And then moving on up, we get the house of the, of the 50s, the kind of minimal house. Everything is machine made. Everything is, all the materials are made in larger factories and whatnot. And even in the 50s, you get a house like this Lustron house, where the house, every component was made in a factory and sent on trucks to the site where it was assembled, much like an erector set, if anyone out there remembers the erector sets with little screws and metal pieces. But the changing in technology can be linked and also kind of goes hand in hand with kind of the evolution of a house. Here we have a house which is pretty decidedly built in two stages. You've got the right side, which is a late 18th century farmhouse to which this large addition, kind of an overwhelming addition of the mid-19th century, has been added. So that really helps to start to understand houses, how they evolve. Something more modest is the rear of this house, where there are the two vertical boards in the center of this back wall. Probably the first one was the original corner of the house, and it would have had a rear porch, which at some point was enclosed, and then there was another room added on to the end of it. These are the kind of things that might get picked up in Sanborn maps like Claudia was referring to, but a lot of it also has to do with understanding the physical evidence there. There are also additions on buildings that are readily understandable straight away. This is obviously built in two periods, the 1920s or 30s stone house on the left, to which a modern addition was built as art gallery during the 1980s. If you're really lucky, you're going to go down your basement, you're going to find all these rolls of blueprints and architectural plans that will show all the changes to your building, will show when it was built, when the changes were made. But for most of us, that doesn't occur. And we have to look at the buildings themselves. So if you look at the differences between the one on the left, the late 18th century house, and the one on the right, the Victorian house, they all have windows, they all have chimneys, they all have porches. But if you start to look at some of the details, and just as an example of the windows on the left are multi-pane, 9/9 windows. The window glass is very much smaller than the one on the right, which is from a late 19th century house. One of the reasons for that is because of technology and how technology has moved from handcrafted, like we said, to more machine-made. Here's some drawings of how early window glass was made. It was hand-blown, spun into a disc, and then that disc was cut into panes. And that's one of the reasons why you get these, wonderful characteristic swirls and whatnot on these early windows, something that is worthy of preserving in its own right. But glass blowing is no longer done by hand. It's done in these big factories. This is a Pilkington factory, and it starts with raw materials and ends up being put in a truck and shipped off. And so this has allowed buildings like this, the glass house, to be built with large sheets of glass. So you see how technology has really changed the evolution of house design and house construction. And that's the case not only with things such as glass, but timber. Most North Carolina houses are timber framed. And we move in in how the timber is produced, the changes from being handmade. This is hand hewing a timber. These timbers have the characteristic hand axed marks on them, easily to identify. But also the changing in technology then moves into a more machine. Well, actually we continue to do hand sewn boards and whatnot by having two men, one at the top of the beam, one at the bottom, using a hand saw. This would be a pit saw situation. The term "you're in the pits" refers to the guy at the bottom who is getting his face full of sawdust with every thrust, with every saw. But what it does is it does give a very characteristic saw mark on the wood that can be identified as you study your house. And this is a pit saw marks. They are more or less vertical, but they're kind of jumbled. They're not real organized because of the way that the saw was taken up and down. Kind of the next step in the evolution of wood technology would be the introduction of sash saw or water-powered saw. We've got a mechanized system of sawing the wood. We've got the vertical up and down saw blades, and as that cuts the wood, it leaves a very characteristic, very regularly spaced parallel saw marks perpendicular to the grain of the wood. Characteristic of first half of the 19th century. For the introduction of the circular saw blade, which we're all familiar with. And it was used for cutting logs into boards one at a time. And it leaves kind of this an arcing saw blade mark. These saw marks come from when a tooth of the saw is slightly out of line, and so you get an extra scribing onto the board. So it's not a straight, it's not perpendicular to the wood, but it really is this arc. Another thing which is it's not only large pieces of wood that have the saw marks. This is the smaller pieces of wood in your house, the plaster lath, which is put on the walls before the plaster is applied. And here in the upper picture, it's a hand split lath. In the lower picture, it's sawn lath. So you easily determine that the hand split lath is an earlier product than the sawn lath. And this is an example of a house in Greensboro where the left side is hand split lath and the right side is sawn lath. And this is actually taken from when the weatherboard was taken off. The inside was all plastered, but this gives good indication that there was a change made because of the different kinds of lath that is used. As it turns out, the sawn lath was used to infill a former door opening. If you got wood, you got to have nails. Nails have changed, again, moving from handmade to machine-made. The wrought nails generally went through the 18 teens until there was a machine-cut nail and then the wire nail that we all know from hardware stores. This is a range of nails from a house that was built in the 1790s, and it includes a lot of the hand-wrought nails, but also the cut nails, which can be used to determine when changes were made within the house. Hand-wrought nails are identified generally at the point, it comes down to a tapered point on all four sides, or sometimes, like in the left nail there, it's a spoon tip. Again, these are made by hand. Blacksmiths or naileries make these. You had a wide variety of specialized use for nails. Then we move into the cut nails, a machine cut nail, which is generally, it's a plate is fed through the machine, and so you get parallel sides. They're very regular, and they were in vogue really for everything until about the turn of the 20th century. And then we have the machine-made wire nails, which are ones everyone is familiar with buying at big box stores or at your local hardware store, or if you really want to, you can buy a nail-making machine shipped from China for a little over $5,000 and make your own nails. Screws, same way. There's a very good dating point in screws because they moved from the flat tip screws in the to the pointed screws in mid-1840s. This change of technology is highly datable, and if you know that the hinges in your house have never been taken apart, then you can back out a screw and see if it's pointed or flat, and that helps date your house. A variety of pointed screws. And also hardware is very readily identifiable as either handmade or machine-made. Here's some blacksmith pieces of hardware from a door, and you move on to a more of a industrialized cast iron hinges. Another change, kind of a bigger change, is really how the house is assembled in itself, going from a heavy post and beam frame house with large members. All members are mortise and tendoned in, pegs are used, large members, and then used really through the first half of the 19th century, in which introduced balloon framing, where you have more slender members. Really, on a two-story house, they run all the way from the bottom, from the first floor up to the roof, so you have very long pieces of lumber, very thin. To how we're framing houses these days, which is kind of floor by floor. Even you see a big apartment house being framed up to 5 or 6 floors, and they move up one floor at a time, short timbers, very densely packed. Bricks, the same way. It's important to look at the brick bonding pattern, whether or not the bricks are handmade. Look at details, shoulders. Is it a step shoulder? Is it a flat shoulder? Bond patterns. This is really just an overview for things to be aware and look at. You've got the obvious changes. A plaster wall was taken down where the fireplace was, and lo and behold, the larger fireplace had been infilled with a smaller fireplace. Same thing with looking for ghost marks of missing pieces. Here's some rafters where collar ties have been taken out, changes occurred. Kind of to conclude, as far as kind of a cool example, this is a house in Edenton. The owners had bought it just to turn into a little rental house. Everyone thought it was maybe a late 19th century tenant house. And it had tongue and groove siding and tongue and groove board on the walls. While they were preparing just to rehab it as a rental property, they realized that lurking beneath Victorian boards was something rather extraordinary, and it was a heavy timbered house with fine details on the joists, wrought nails throughout. Once all the owners were great because they said, well, that's cool, let's take all the stuff out. So what was revealed was a framed house that was very early in Edenton. Research showed that it was, could be earlier than anyone had imagined. It had details like this oak brace included. And the decision was made to go with what's the most, probably the most precise dating method for a house, and that is to count tree rings, which we all did when we were kids. In this instance, you're looking at the tree rings within a structural member of the house. And so a core is drilled out, and it has to include that outside edge, the last growth rings, to be of any value. And it's cored out, taken out, and someone more knowledgeable than me looks at the rings and lines them up with a master known sample. And in this case, it was concluded that the main structural members of this house were felled in 1718, 1719, which made this house, this little house in Edenton, the oldest dated house in North Carolina, or the newest, oldest house, as I like to call it. A good thing to take a look at, you could Google, is the National Park Service has put together a great series of technical briefs on preservation. One of them, Preservation Brief 35, which you can Google, is about understanding old buildings and the process of architectural investigation. So, if you talk to your house, it can teach you things, and it will be happy that you care. Houses are incredible things, so take care of yours. So thank you. I think that concludes our presentations. We may have a few minutes for questions, and be sure to do the Survey Monkey files. Let us know how we did.
Okay, we do have a question from one of our viewers. Jim asks, in searching on these sites, what address do you use for an old property that has had a route number in the past and in the last 30 years has been changed to a street address? The property's in a rural area. What do you guys think?
Well,
I think the modern address should work using our street tool. This is a entirely modern system. So I think entering the new street address with house number should go to that property. Now, if it's a rural property, it could be several hundred acres, so it may not be anywhere near the house, but it would at least get the property, come close to it.
and in the tax records, you would, or the local real estate records, county real estate records, you'd enter that, what they call the 911 number, the street number, the current address.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.